by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I am your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and joining us today is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the program. We've got a great show. Let me clear my throat. We're going to be talking about 4 topics. Ship Tracks is back in the news, a new paper coming out, maybe supporting some things that Leah and I have been saying on the show here. We're also going to be discussing absolute dating techniques using Miyake events. So if you don't remember, we've had several podcasts and radio shows on the topic of Miyake events. These are huge solar storms that no one really knows what they are, but what happens is cosmic ray bombardment of the Earth. And what you get from that is all the cosmogenic nucleotides that then get stuck in the wood of the trees. Mm-hmm. So there's we're going to be looking at a Neolithic site over 7,000 years old that preserves one of these Miyake events and allows for absolute dating of the site. Pretty fantastic.
Indeed.
Second half of the show, or maybe earlier, we're going to get into a creationist argument. And I find it hilarious that there's museums and whole projects dedicated to this fraud. And so we'll check out, did humans walk with dinosaurs? That is the big question. Several people have purported evidence in the form of fossil footprints of humans and dinosaurs on the same rock. It's that insane. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about that. And these tracks that we're specifically going to talk about are in the Paluxy River. And then the final topic, which is a fantastic discovery, and I find it fascinating that things that are in textbooks still, they're now in millions of textbooks, the way we learn about the formation of gold, that story has been rocked by a new discovery, the piezoelectric force in quartz grains in fault lines forming giant gold nuggets. A fascinating discovery that was proven by direct measurement and their own observations during their own experiment, where they recreated an earthquake with quartz and gold, and they were able to precipitate quartz or gold onto the quartz. So that's pretty fantastic. Any opening remarks on any of those topics?
No, except that I just personally never really thought about the gold formation, how gold nuggets are formed myself, because I'm not a geologist. So,
I will tell you the story that I learned before we get into the paper when we reach that topic. So first, let's start off with the topic of ship tracks. Now, for those of you who don't know what ship tracks are, let me just pull up a picture here. In Radioland, you're not going to be able to see this at all. But if you rewatch, do they rewatch the show?
If you come see us at 8 p.m. Mountain Time tonight on YouTube on Magnetic Reversal News, you can watch the replay and actually see the video and see the ship tracks.
Yeah, so ship tracks are these huge contrails, just like chemtrails, which don't exist. These are persistent contrails that are coming from ships because they burn what is called bunker fuel, high in sulfur. And that was banned 2 years ago. And subsequently, scenes like the one you see on the screen, which if you could see it, show that the entire Atlantic Ocean is covered with thin, wispy clouds that are as a result of ships moving across the ocean. Mm-hmm. Now, if you remove these ship tracks, what happens? The water is exposed now to direct sunlight, and it causes rapid heating of the oceans, which is what many climate change fearmongers are reporting has happened in the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. That's pretty convenient. Mm-hmm. Now, the fascinating thing is a peer-reviewed paper just published in the Geophysical Research Letters titled, "Has Reducing Ship Emissions Brought Forward Global Warming?" is now out and available for all people to read. Did you scrutinize this paper?
I did, and I'll be honest, I have a lot of issues with this paper. Now, it
Okay, so
doesn't mean, huh?
go ahead.
It doesn't mean that, so you know, the basic essence of ship tracks being that the ship tracks are creating an albedo effect, a brightening of the clouds, as it were, and then reflecting sunlight back into space. And so the removal of the bunker fuel reduces the ship tracks by a significant amount, according to this paper, by roughly 80% or a bit less than that, and then thus causing global warming. Now, that doesn't mean that that is incorrect, but how do I put this? I have a hard time articulating what my issue with is in this paper. I was saying this last week in our show. There's so many different variables that are involved in weather and in temperature, whether we're talking about via satellite data, sea surface temperatures, whatever it is. There's so many different variables here. We have things like the AMOC, and we have the ENSO cycle, and all of these things affect our temperature and our climate. And this paper does not do a good job of isolating the ship track, or the lack of, does not isolate that variable very well, in my opinion. So I'll just give you one example, if I can sort of summarize this. This paper basically concludes, and the way that they conclude this I have an issue with as well, but that the lack of ship tracks have induced a net radiative forcing of 0.12 watts per square meter, right? But they also talk about later, they're analyzing essentially radiative forcing for 2 different years, 2019 and I think 2017. Yeah, 2017 and 2019. So this is prior to the time that the bunker fuel was banned. So there were ship tracks at this time. And then they acknowledged that those 2 years were very different in terms of the ENSO cycle. So one's like a moderately cold year, one's like a moderately warm year, to put it simply. And they say that the net difference between those 2 years is minus 2.5 watts per square meter. And that, yeah. And then they say, well, because this is about the largest difference that we see in this data, that then shows that the effect of removing the bunker fuel is completely independent. And I can't for the life of me in this paper understand how that's indicated, that the ship track data, the differences in the ship track data, is completely independent of 2 years where there's a different ENSO cycle, the differences between those two, partially just because of the magnitude of the numbers that we're talking about. You know, if the difference due to the banning of the bunker fuel is 0.12 watts per square meter, and the difference between those 2 years that they looked at is negative 2.5 watts per square meter, then why does that show that the lack of bunker fuel, the difference in the data, is completely independent? I don't get it. I really don't.
Well, it doesn't show that at all, but what it does reveal is that if their key point, which is that the recent regulations on sulfur emissions have decreased ship tracks and resulted in plus 0.12 watts per square meter of radiative forcing, what that means is that this amount of forcing is 25 times less than natural variability.
Right. Right. So there's the
nothing.
problem.
It means nothing.
It
Their
doesn't mean anything.
conclusion that they found is such a fraction of natural variability that it could not have a force whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and then additionally, and I kind of mentioned this in passing when I was trying to explain this, the 0.12 watts per square meter that they identified as essentially being the radiative forcing effect of the banning of the bunker fuels, they came to that conclusion using 5 different model simulations. And we've talked about this before, right? A model simulation is only as good as the inputs and the modeling is accurate, right? We're doing all of this predictive science using these models, but like we don't necessarily know if the models are accurate. Like, are the models based on a presumption that anthropogenic global warming is really a thing? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And they find good agreement between the models, but it's like, okay, that again is like talking about as if science is based on consensus. That's basically what they found. They found consensus in their models. That's it. I don't think you can make any further conclusions beyond that. Now, again, I'm not saying that the absence of ship tracks may influence the climate on Earth, but I'm in no way convinced that the level of the effect, as illustrated by this paper, is in any way accurate. Like, there's a bunch more in here that I take issue with, but that's the essence of it.
Right. And without even doing an investigation or running a model, you can clearly see that by removing ship tracks, the Atlantic Ocean is definitely going to get warmer.
Right. And that's totally a reasonable conclusion to come to. But again, it's a question of magnitude and how much effect is that really, and how does that compare to all of the other factors that go into our global climate? The sun, the ENSO cycle, the things like the AMOC, like all of those different factors that none of that is really taken into account here. And in fact, I'm a little confused about which model they're talking about, but at some point in here, they're talking about one of the models that they're working with, and they specifically say that that model does not include the ENSO cycle. So it's like, well, I don't really have any reason to believe what you're saying then.
Yeah, because based on their conclusions, the ENSO cycle alone has 25 times more effect on climate than the ship tracks do.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even include that.
Right.
In the model.
And then there's some other issues in here too, in terms of like localization, right? Like sometimes they'll say something like, well, it affected the North Atlantic in this way, but it didn't really affect the rest of the globe that much. And how do you parse that out exactly, right? Because even if you have a localized effect in a certain time frame and you can kind of identify that, like, well, how does that translate into the future? Like, as far as, heat moving around the globe and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know. It's also, this is a pretty confusing read too, I will say.
All right. Well, we really haven't concluded anything except
no.
Kudos to them for getting rid of bunker fuel.
Right. But if you're a Bill Gates and you want to present solutions to bring the global temperature down, which very well may happen on its own, as we would predict, I guess this would be one way to do it, would be to reintroduce bunker fuel so that we have more ship tracks and more albedo effect to reflect sunlight into space. Well, which is probably going to happen on its own just via cosmic rays inducing cloud nucleation.
Now everyone's going to think we get paid by the oil and gas industry.
Yeah. Right.
All right. The second paper we're going to talk about just came out in May of this year. Absolute dating of European Neolithic using the 5259 BC rapid carbon-14 excursion. And what that means in layman's terms is that they are using absolute dating of an archaeological site in the European Neolithic, and they're using wood because the only way we can determine what the 5259 BC rapid carbon-14 excursion is to identify the Miyake event in a tree ring. So you have to have ancient wood from the site. You got to study each sliver of wood, do a chemical analysis. And if you get a massive carbon-14, beryllium, and other cosmogenic nucleotides spiking in that ring, you've just found a Miyake event. And in this case, they knew the general time period, and they said, hey, we know of this Miyake event. Can we find it here in the wood? And guess what? They found it in the wood.
Yeah, yeah. Very cool. By the way, this paper was sent to me by a viewer, Rosemary, so thank you for that. It's pretty interesting, right? Because the dendrochronology provides quite a lot of information if calibrated, right? Like there are occasions where you can line up a particular tree ring with a particular year, right? Like let's say in more recent history, maybe you have a building that used certain trees and you know the exact date of the building. Well, then you can usually then determine an exact year for a particular tree ring. But going back in history, you can't always do that, and that also requires a huge volume of data and analysis that's already been done.
Yeah.
And this really helps calibrate, going back thousands of years in history. So it's pretty fascinating and very useful for future study of lots of things.
Yeah, so the
Right.
initial problem is that they don't have dendrochronology going back 7,300 years in
Exactly.
this part of Greece.
Yeah.
And the wood that they had from the site only spanned a few hundred years of tree rings.
Right.
But amazingly enough, it included the 5259 Miyake event. Was it in the oak or the juniper?
I think it was
It
in
was
the
in
juniper.
the last year of the juniper ring, right?
Oh, I'm not sure, actually. I'm not
It
sure
was
about
that crazy that it was a complete accident. If the tree was a year older or something, it wouldn't have had the Miyake event.
Right, right. Because if you had another set of dendrochronology tree rings that encompassed the year 5259, where we know we had this explosion of C14 in the tree
BC,
rings.
that's 5259 BC.
What did I say?
You just said 5259.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the clarification. Then, if you had another data set, even if the tree rings that we have for this particular site didn't encompass that year, if it was close enough, you would have been able to correlate all of the surrounding tree rings. But but we didn't have that, and it was particularly lucky that these junipers had 5259 in there. The other thing that's interesting to me about this too, we talked, I think it was last week, and I don't remember the context specifically. No, it was a few weeks ago. We were talking about some other paper, and one of the things that they mentioned is that generally speaking, plants don't readily take up C14 very well. They obviously take up some of it. So what's interesting to me is that if you were to really examine the amounts of C14, in reality, that would be actually the amount of C14 in the tree rings is actually going to be way less than was actually in the environment, simply because the plants don't take that much of it up. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's why it's easy to determine a spike because there's none in the other rings.
Right.
Now, what I find this, if you don't know about Despilio, it's a famous Neolithic site in northern Greece. So what we have is a community of people 7,300 years ago that are very advanced. They're building these piers and structures out into this lake, and they even build their homes on the piers.
Mm-hmm.
So their homes are located out over the water. That must have been for a reason, for stability of temperature, something.
Well, it's interesting too, because this has obviously been a wet area for a really long time, right? The fact that this is a wet area is the only reason that we have this wood at all. Because you have like this oxygen deprived environment that's very
Yes.
wet and that's preserving the wood. And it was obviously wet then because they were building on piers. So that's
it
interesting
has
too.
to have been, just like the 2 million-year-old DNA, this site has to have been saturated for the entire time.
Yeah. Well, it's
Just
also
one
like
little break in the saturation would cause everything to decay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same with the discovery that we reviewed of the ancient wooden structure that was, I can never remember. It was like 175,000.
330 million?
What?
330 million years old.
I thought it was 330,000 years
Oh,
old.
1,000, a million. Yeah, like there are
Yeah,
people.
it's like I don't think
No,
human
it's like
hominids have been around quite
300,000
that
and they
long.
think it was Denisovan or some non-Homo sapien.
Right. Predated anatomically modern humans. But again, so another situation where the wood was actually being preserved by a wet environment and it had to be wet for all of those hundreds of thousands of years, which is fascinating.
There are spears that are also 300,000 years old.
Wow.
Wooden, obviously, because they were preserved in bogs.
Yeah.
And they're not made by modern humans. They're made by some other hominid.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that fascinating? I mean, for everything that you and I know about the the fact that Earth is not stable, that the climate is not stable, that there are major changes that happens over geological time, and yet somehow we still have particular areas that remain relatively similar.
Yeah, and some that are completely different, like the
Mhm.
African Sahara
Sure.
or area. Most areas of Africa were at this time completely wet
Right.
with grasslands and animals, and now it's there's nothing there in the desert.
Right.
Lake Chad was the largest inland lake in all of the world, and it barely exists today. So it's been
Right.
drying up for 7,000 years.
Right. Right. Right.
Now it's like a pond.
Right. Right.
Yes.
Well,
Go
sort of
ahead.
getting back to this paper, I mean, you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I mean, one of the things that's interesting is like, we've got a 188-year history that we know of for this. I'm going to call it community.
Yeah.
Although they say, it wasn't necessarily continuous. To me, it looks like it probably was, but there's like specific spurts in building, and so, this is at least, it's probably more than 200 years, right? Because you're not necessarily building the entire time, but this appears to be a fairly continuous occupation for quite some time, right? I mean, the United States has only been around for a couple hundred years, so,
And right. So 7,000 years ago, they were pile driving. Let that
yeah,
sink in. They were driving piles and making piers that were so well engineered they could then build a house on it.
right, right.
These people actually occupied the area for thousands of years but discontinuously. So it's a really good spot to live. Obviously, if you're on the margin of a lake, you got all the great plants and animals and on the lake margin, you got all the fish in the lake, you got all the animals coming to the margin of the lake to drink. It's literally like a paradise where you could probably be in your hut, peek your head out early in the morning. It's the little deer sitting there drinking and shoot them with your arrow
Right, right.
and not have to go anywhere.
Well, and this also, I mean, maybe not terribly strongly, but it does also challenge this, long-standing narrative that, we were hunter-gatherers up until about 6,000 years ago. Well, clearly that's not the case here. I mean, these people are settled.
And Despilio also is very famous, this site, Despilio, Greece, for the Despilio tablet, which we now can absolute date to at least to around 7,300 years ago. This is before there's writing. And right here, there's writing on this tablet. No one knows what it means, but clearly this is an arrow and another arrow pointing a different way. This looks like a dude, maybe. This is a triangle with a dot in it that has open ends on two sides, not over here. And so these are symbols that look very similar to language that comes to the forefront a few thousand years later, like linear A and
It
linear
looks a
B.
little
They
like
look like this.
cuneiform.
Cuneiform, right.
Yeah.
And so we had to have language for hundreds of thousands of years. The hominids 300,000 years ago making spears and building log cabins didn't do it by going, ooh, and not saying anything.
Well, and I mean, you could say too that the demarcation for, let's say, writing is a little ambiguous, right? Like, you could also argue that these symbols look like a lot of things that we've seen in petroglyphs, right? Now, we typically don't call petroglyphs writing, but it's obviously intended to communicate something. It might be more pictorial, but there is like this gradual transition between sort of pictorial symbols and then
Yeah.
language. And I don't know exactly how you make that demarcation, and I don't think it's very important, right? Because to me, it's like, okay, the theme is human beings, like you said, have had hundreds of thousands of years of language. We've been communicating probably since the beginning of our existence. And, there have been times where we mark these things down, whether we found them or not. And like, what difference does it make if it's pictorial or a word? Like, it's irrelevant in my view.
Well, yeah, go Begley Tepe. Let's go back there. 12,000
Right,
years
like
ago.
I was going to say that. Yeah.
They're using advanced language to engineer these sites, right? There has to be advanced planning. group structure, all kinds of advanced engineering. And then the discussion about how to portray what they're trying to portray in the bas-relief and all the intricate carvings, which is clearly the representation of the language. It can be nothing else but that.
Right. Well,
so in ancient times, we didn't scribble things down in cursive or print. We didn't need letters. A single image was paragraphs of information that people knew.
Yeah, that's essentially what I was about to say, right? Because it's the most important part of that is that the information that was being transmitted by Gobekli Tepe is really advanced, right? Like it's advanced astronomical data as far as we can tell. And in reality, it's much more efficient to portray that information in images than anything else, which is probably why they did it that way.
Yeah, and the structures that Gobekli Tepe that are repeated again and again,
right,
are like encyclopedias. If you look just at the bas-relief, that has one story. But then that's sitting on a pillar that's representing a cosmology that is a whole nother level of scientific endeavor where the whole structure itself has embedded math and cosmology on top of the narratives on each pillar.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally an encyclopedia of everything these people knew. And they said, how do we put it all into a structure?
Yeah.
It's literally Noah's Ark, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this many times on this show, but the way that we essentially put down the people of the past as being simple and stupid, I find highly offensive. You know, like, and it's clearly not the case. It's clear that like human beings have been capable of complex and advanced knowledge for thousands of years, probably hundreds of thousands of years. And I don't see any reason why that would have changed so much over our evolution as what our official narrative traditionally suggests.
Right, because we really didn't get smarter. Our brains have been the same size. In fact, during the last glacial maximum, there are skulls that are actually larger than our current modern anatomical skulls. So we may have actually been smarter 40,000 years ago.
Right. I mean, but that's only if there really is a correlation between brain size and intelligence, which is somewhat debatable, but anyway.
And it's a good segue to the next topic. Did humans live with dinosaurs? Because we got to go back tens of millions of years, 100 million years to be walking with them.
Yeah. Well, no, not according to the creationists, right? The creationists would say rather that the dinosaurs were around like 6,000 years ago.
Right, up into the flood.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Which is part of the problem with this whole venture. But anyway.
What did you say?
I was just going to say that's part of the problem of like when someone claims that whether or not the man tracks are real, which I do not think they are, but we'll get into that. You know, claiming that the man tracks next to the dinosaur tracks is evidence of the falsity of evolution, it really doesn't prove anything, right? Like these people are using that to say, well, you know, or God's creation is only 6,000 years old. But you could also make the sort of the opposite claim that, oh, well, this means that man was around millions of years ago. Doesn't prove anything, you know?
It's one or the other. But the problem is that all of these claims come from creationists that don't have degrees in geology. So how could they even know what they're looking at in the field to begin with? The other suspect thing is that the prints are fake.
Well, they're either fake or they don't look like anything.
This is called the Delk print, and you can go to the Creationist Museum and go see it. It's on display. This is what they claim is a human footprint, and this is what they claim is a dinosaur footprint. When I first saw this, when I first dove into the story, I immediately looked at the dinosaur footprint and said, that's not a dinosaur footprint. That is what someone carved into a rock that thought they knew what a dinosaur footprint looked like.
Yeah.
Because they don't look like this. They do not look like a perfectly preserved print of a three-toed animal. The mud fills in. Not a single print looks like this in all of the pterosaur prints I've ever seen, and I've probably seen most of them because there's not a lot of them. You could just
It's
Google
funny,
pterosaur prints. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I can't quite put my finger on it, but just when I look at this image, it just looks fake to me, and I can't identify a specific visual feature as to why that is.
We've got tons of human footprints, and none of them are perfectly preserved as if you just stepped there yesterday. They don't look like this. They look like shadows of a footprint, or you can see some. They're not perfect. Whoever carved this carved a perfect footprint, which does not exist in fossil footprints. So that's what the problem. They didn't study enough footprints that are real of dinosaurs and humans before they carved this, which immediately, to a geologist like me, a paleontologist, I looked at it and said, that's a carving. It's fake.
This one I can identify exactly why it looks fake. If you look at where the body of the foot meets the toes, right, like the impression is so like drastic, like the depth drops off so quickly, and it's also lacking like at the top of the body of the footprint, there's like a contour kind of, right? And that should be sort of more gradual, and instead it's sort of this straight line across. Like it doesn't look right at all.
So here's what this is a real dinosaur pterosaur footprint.
So there's the graduation in depth that looks more genuine. Whereas the other one,
you have to have a claw. You can see the claw on every toe.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
There's none of that there. This is fake.
Right.
This is like a big footprint.
Right. Well, and also in order to positively identify one of those footprints, if you go back to the genuine one, I mean, you would need multiple instances of this pattern to really say that that's really what it is, right? You need to see that repeated in nature.
That's another natural pterosaur with claws.
Mm-hmm.
Fake.
And I mean, if you're gonna pull off a hoax, like you really should do your research first.
Yeah, you could have done so much better.
Yeah.
Now the guy who is running the scam is Carl Baugh. I think that's how you say it. Baugh. Mm-hmm. How would you say that?
I would say Baugh.
Carl Baugh. He's got all kind of fakes. He's got a fake handprint from the Triassic as well, which is clearly carved. And the funny thing is, his daughter knows it's fake because she watched him make it. and she's come out. And so we'll leave you links to this, Stones and Bones. And there are 4 links here. Carl Baugh's latest fake, Baugh's fake foot, round 2, playing footsie with the truth, and other views on Baugh's fake foot. And as it happened, it was so certain there would be a fake patina on the carving that I overinterpreted an early published photo of the fake footprints. It turned out that a much better photo was published by a creationist supporter of Baugh, which did clearly show the obvious result of an acid wash. A short while later, the granddaughter of one of the local footprint artists told the newspaper how her grandfather had faked human and dinosaur footprints, including the detail of using acid to make it look old. What are your thoughts?
So this article that you sent me by Randy Moore, who really sort of puts the kibosh on this.
Because he went out and looked at the site.
Well, yeah. So I mean, this is fascinating, right? He goes out and accompanies Baugh and a team of people on an excavation of dinosaur and man tracks, right? And this is important that he accompanied them because they made a claim, if I can find it, that the tracks erode and or dry out within an hour or so after being uncovered, and in doing so become invisible. It's like, wow, how convenient is that? And that also sounds like wildly unrealistic.
Right.
Especially because you're dealing with rock. So what's
the Triassic rock? It's rock. It doesn't dry out. It's already dry. Liquefied. It's already yeah.
Right.
So you're looking at this is one of the dried out man tracks. We're looking at it.
Yeah. I don't even know what I'm looking at.
All
Where
it
is
is a depression in a rock that they're claiming used to be a footprint. It's similar to Mud Fossil University,
Yeah.
where they think that you can, if a rock is shaped like a sphinx, it's a sphinx. You know what I mean? Or it's an ancient dinosaur egg.
Yeah.
This is imagination.
Yeah. Well, so what I was gonna say is now, like Randy Moore here, like really gave Baugh and his team the benefit of the doubt because,
Here's
like,
another one.
okay,
Here's another one.
yeah, like again, I don't. What am I looking at? I don't even know. Like, if I walked by, I would walk right by that because there's nothing there. And as he rightly points out in this article, like not one of these supposed man tracks looks any different than any of the other natural, marks and depressions in the surrounding area.
Yeah, because
So
they're not tracks. They're just depressions.
so he nonetheless, he really gave these people the benefit of the doubt, and he's like, okay, well, if they dry out within an hour or whatever, then I'll come with you and let me accompany you on an excavation. I wonder how he managed to accomplish this, because I can guarantee that he'll never be invited back on one of these excavations ever again. But what's so fascinating to me is that there were 30 people on this excavation team. So there's like 30 people on this team uncovering these completely amorphous depressions and going, oh, look, it's a man track. And I'm like, how does this happen? Is this like mass formation psychosis or
No,
something?
yeah, okay. So I did the research. They run the Creation Museum, and the number one thing they do is dinosaur digs here at this site. So those people are all creationists that paid $200 to be quote unquote on a dinosaur dig with Baugh, their hero. And of course, they're finding man tracks everywhere. They think the Earth is 6,000 years old. There is a problem in their brain. So they're
Right.
going out there to find nothing, and he's agreeing with them because they paid money to come out here to find man tracks,
Right,
with
which they
dinosaur.
supposedly verified somehow because they're all experts. I mean, it's the I talked about this recently. There's a real problem with people not knowing what evidence actually is.
Right.
Right? Like I was relating the story of and I won't get into it here, of somebody that I got into an argument with on Twitter, who sent me a media article to support their argument. And the media article cited a study, but didn't give the link to the study, which was a red flag to me. So I went and I did a little digging and I found the study pretty easily. And then I read the study, and the study did not conclude what the article claimed it did. So the study actually disproved this person's argument. And when I pointed this out to them, they were completely unable to respond to that. They had nothing to say to that. And they just kept saying, there's evidence for what I'm saying. And I'm like, okay, well, if there's other evidence, then please show me the other evidence. This is not it. This article is not it. And this study disproves what you're saying, but I'm still willing to listen to you. If there's more evidence, please show me. And I never got that, which it's really interesting because there's two problems. There's the problem of I have a belief and no amount of evidence can deter me from that belief. And that's what these people are doing. The creationists that are going on these excavations, like they're looking at nothing and deluding themselves into thinking that it is evidence of their belief.
Leah, look, they put little rocks around the footprint. Don't you see that? That's so that no one disturbs it. I mean,
Right, I'm the crazy
this is
one.
amazing. This rewrites all of geologic history, this footprint here.
Yeah. Well, so it's the two things. It's the believing that there's this thing that you're delusionally thinking supports your belief, and then there's the added problem of, okay, here's another piece of evidence that now disproves your belief, and they can't ingest that at all. It's really, I mean, I don't know what it is. Like, is it? I mean, you and I have the benefit of being really well educated. Even from like a young age. Like I've said this many times, I actually had an amazing public school education, and not many people can say that. I really learned a lot about a lot of things, but also specifically about the scientific method and what constitutes real evidence, and how you develop a theory, and how you evaluate the accuracy of that theory. And then I went further, right? In college, I studied philosophy of science and physics, but the philosophy of science part really teaches you how to evaluate how well any particular knowledge system describes reality, right? That's one way of putting it anyway. And like, I don't know, you and I can't really figure out why this happens with people. Maybe because I'm coming from a biased perspective of having a really good education about what evidence really is, and what an elegant theory actually is. And a lot of people don't have that, but it's still, regardless, it's weird to me that you can be so taken with the belief that you just can't see how things that don't fit or disprove it are important. Like I don't get it. Like, why does that happen?
Well, and plus they're displaying this at the Creation Evidence Museum, and they're being dishonest to all the people that are Christians.
Yeah.
And they're doing it on purpose. Every
Right.
scientist has disproven this. They came and they look at it and they're like, that's fake. It's carved.
Right.
There's not a single footprint that looks like this. It's not even a dinosaur. It's a bad fake.
Right.
And yet they have it on display knowing it's a fraud.
Right. And then meanwhile saying that all of the people, like, what is it? There's some reference to that this group, I think it was in this article, prays for people who believe in evolution. Like they're the people who are trying to the people who believe in evolution, or whatever. Let's not even call it evolution. Let's just call it because
Geologic
evolution,
history.
there are issues with evolution, right? But whatever, yeah, Earth's history, geology, actual data and evidence, those are the people that are trying to bamboozle you. And it's like, what? And the irony, it's so immoral to mislead people this way. Like, if you're doing this, there's no way that you don't know that you're trying to mislead someone, because you're sitting there carving the fake print. So like, you are tremendously immoral.
And then write books.
But you're claiming you're some good Christian or something. I mean, it's disgusting.
Right. You fake the evidence. You charge people hundreds of dollars and gaslight them that these depressions are human footprints. And you've been doing it for decades. You write books. You sell them. You create a museum. You create a nonprofit where millions of dollars flow in for a fraud. Right. Sounds like the federal government to me.
Yeah, I'm right. Exactly. I mean, you're going to the ends of the earth to present this fraud and mislead people. And it's like, for what? Like, is this guy really making money off of this? Like, what is his goal? I mean, because it seems like his main aim is to mislead people.
This guy is making millions. He was able to open up a museum, and he's got buses. I mean, it's all based on the fraud.
I can think of some other people we know that mislead people for money, but they shall remain unnamed right now.
Right. So all the links to Carl Ball's fraud will be below. And so go check them out.
Yeah.
Those are some real this is what a real dinosaur footprint looks like, by the way.
Yeah. 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 And there are real truth seekers out there, and then there's some fake ones. And that's really a shame. And I will say too that one of the telltale signs, I think, of like a fake truth seeker or a person who's being fraudulent is often that they will point to the people that criticize them and say, "Oh no, they're the ones who are trying to mislead you." I mean, the gaslighting is insane. But I feel like that's very common, that tactic. To just dismiss somebody, not address their evidence or their criticism at all, and say, well, I'm just not even going to listen to you because I know that you're just trying to mislead people. I mean, this happens in politics. It happens in every arena, but.
And then they block everyone. The number one example is Michael Mann. Every single climatologist and paleontologist is now blocked from his Twitter. He literally follows no one except his colleagues at university, because he's blocked every single one of us. Everyone. That is a fraud.
Yeah. Well, and it just furthers living in an echo chamber, right? Where you can continue on with your fraud and be confirmed by the people that agree with your fraud or who also want to perpetrate the fraud. And never, and you just continue insulating yourself from that, and you never have to listen to any of the criticism.
Conclusion: humans didn't walk with dinosaurs, which isn't a bad thing, because 15,000 years ago, we were walking around with the most dangerous megafauna that ever lived on Earth. And
Yeah.
so there was some serious stuff going on in recent human history.
Right. And that's stuff for which we actually do have real evidence, So like,
And real footprints.
yeah. It's like, it's as simple. Well, okay. Also, then you have to ask this question, right? So, like, let's say with large megafauna, one example of a piece of evidence you might find for that would be finding the bones of a mammoth, which have clearly been manipulated by human beings, right? Like
we have a
cut marks.
mammoth bone that has a Clovis point embedded in it.
Sure, something like that, right? So why are we not finding, if humans were walking with dinosaurs? Why were we not finding dinosaur bones with evidence of unnatural, meaning not man-made manipulations? I mean, I guess you could be like, oh, well, humans weren't hunting dinosaurs or something like that. But like, we've dug up a fair number of dinosaur bones, and the lack of evidence doesn't prove anything. But like, there's no
humans. We know humans love megafauna. It feeds everyone. That's why they killed mammoths. So
Right.
Clearly, if they were alive during dinosaurs, they would have been killing dinosaurs.
Probably. Well, also because dinosaurs would have been an enormous threat. So if human beings were able to cooperate enough to take down large dinosaurs, we probably would have been doing it. Oh, this is so funny that we're having this conversation. Look at my shirt. I don't know if it's backwards on there, but it says,
it's good.
My whole family is made of meat. I've had the shirt for a very long time, and I've had questions about it for years. Like, what does that mean? Or are you against eating meat? Are you for eating meat? And it's just, it's a t-shirt from a site. I don't even know if it still exists, called quant.com. That's for nerds. And they have this whole comic strip based on Tyrannosaurus Rex. And this is just your family from the perspective of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. That's all it is.
All right, we got 10 minutes to finish up on the last topic. Electricity generated by earthquakes might be the secret behind giant gold nuggets.
Cool.
And I do have a picture of the experiment where here's the quartz crystal, the quartz grain in their experiment, and there is the gold nugget sticking to the side of it after they induced piezoelectric current in the substrate, proving the point. And the point is pretty groundbreaking. Now, as a geologist, you're taught the simple mechanism of gold formation is that these precious metals form deep in the mantle, and they're in solution. And so when fractures occur up near the surface due to fault movement, you get these hydrothermal fluids in volcanic areas that can easily move up towards the surface. And within these fluids is where you get all the fancy gemstones, sapphire and stuff, and gold and silver. These minerals are in solution, and as the hot water comes up and is cooled, they precipitate out into that vein. And so that's where all the gold miners would go into the quartz vein and find the gold nuggets. That was the story. It was a slow precipitation. But then they started finding 40 pounds, 70 pounds. The biggest nugget's 160-pound nugget.
Yeah.
And there's no way that can form through this slow precipitation process. The amount of gold that's in these fluids is in the parts per million. So you would need like thousands of or millions of years of it being hot to accumulate that size of a nugget. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
But this works.
Right. I mean, the reason it works, right, is piezoelectric, meaning that the quartz essentially generates electricity with stress, with pressure, right? And then that the quartz itself is an insulator, but the gold is a conductor. That helps explain why the gold is all accumulating in one place, right? So you get a little bit of gold right here, and then over time, with like an earthquake or a volcano, some kind of pressure stressor coming up, generating electricity, the quartz generating electricity. Now this little spot of gold can continue to accumulate gold, right? It's not going to accumulate in a uniform way. That's sort of the whole point here. And it's because the quartz is an insulator, but the gold is a conductor. So it's going to continue attracting gold to the same place, which is why you would get a nugget.
Yeah, and the assumption also is that once the gold is on the substrate, the quartz, the SiO2, that subsequent reactivation of the piezoelectric effect will then draw gold to itself because it's easier to stick to itself than back onto the quartz. So it's almost like once the gold baby nugget's there, it's like a pearl. It grows over time through these electrical events.
Well, and it's more that it's that the quartz is going to really repel the gold because it's an insulator, right? And versus what the gold is going to do, which is actually going to attract more gold.
Yeah. And so on these fault lines that are most active, like in the West, that move pretty regularly every decade, 100,000 years, at depth, you might get gold. Yeah. So in the future, they might find a way to remote sense like where high piezoelectric zones are in Earth, and then go send drill a well there and see if there's any gold there.
I was just thinking that, like, I don't know that much about, I mean, people who collect gold typically will go to like a stream to pan, or like, how do people identify like where they should go to look for gold? Is it based solely on where someone else found it?
There's lots of ways. So up in, let's say, Canada, the gold is in, huge river deposits where they simply sluice it. They vacuum it up and they run it through these gold separators. Mm-hmm. And so the simple way to assay for gold is to go to a place, collect a bunch of 5-gallon buckets. If it's placer, meaning deposited sedimentary, like by a river or something, that's placer in the stream sediment or a stream bank, you go get some 5-gallon buckets and you pan it all. You see how much gold you get. If you get 8 nuggets, you go back there and you do it. It's your claim. So it's based on exploration, mere solely. Right. It's the same way they find diamonds. There's kimberlites in Colorado. They send geologists out to creeks. They collect 5-gallon buckets of sediment and they look for diamonds. If they find diamonds, they know that they're coming from upstream of that area. And then they locate the kimberlite pipe that way.
Well, that's interesting because the trial and error part of finding gold would be part of what determines its high value, right? So if there's a predictive way of finding gold that makes it easier and less expensive to find it, then that could actually bring the value of gold down, which is interesting.
I don't think it would be that much. You still have to do all the things you need to do to extract gold. That sets the price. Right. So even if you knew where all the deposits were, you still got to go there with heavy equipment, mine it out, break it up, and do all the things to make it into gold. Right. I don't think it would affect the value.
Right.
Maybe more people would be mining gold, but it would still be a very difficult process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because think about it. These fault deposits, if that's what we're now able to locate, they're usually very thin because a fault line is just a plane where two things move along. So the veins are typically only a few feet thick, the veins of quartz, and they have to go deep into the earth and follow that specific vein to keep getting the gold.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult process.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why it's much easier with equipment to then just to be mining sediments in gold-rich areas. You just take all the soil that's been accumulating for tens of thousands of years and you extract all the gold from it because there's gold in it. The gold is constantly weathering out of the vein for all of geologic time. And so it's all the gold that was once in that vein that's eroded is now somewhere deposited as a sediment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This gives me a slightly new appreciation of rutilated quartz, right? Quartz that has little thin veins of gold in it. My sister was just here visiting and just gave me a pair of earrings of rutilated quartz.
It doesn't have gold in it. It has the mineral rutile.
Oh, I thought rutilated quartz was gold.
No, rutile is a mineral. It's acicular asbestiform mineral, meaning it forms needle-like crystals.
Oh.
So if you were to breathe rutile, you could get mesothelioma or lung cancer.
Sure.
But it forms in the quartz. Now, how's that happening?
Right. Well, and then there's also tourmalated quartz, another thing that I'm very much fond of, which has tourmaline in it.
Which is another monoclinic acicular mineral, meaning
I don't know what you just said.
It grows as a rod.
Yeah.
The other one is a needle. So they all grow in one direction, monoclinic. It pulls out into a line. So that has something to do with the crystal lattice and the fact that these quartz only allow rod-like minerals to grow inside them.
Interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
All of science is fascinating.
Indeed.
We'll leave you the paper, but it's only the abstract. You got to pay for it because it's brand new.
Yeah, it's probably like $40.
What?
It's probably $40.
$29 for
oh, that's cheap.
For a month.
Oh, no, that's a month. The article itself is probably $40.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually it's around $40.
But you can access it through your institution if you're still in school.
Yeah. I missed the days where I had a job where I had institutional access to journal articles. That was very convenient. And I really despise that journal articles are very expensive to buy. Otherwise.
Great show. Lee and I will be at the 35th Annual Crestone Energy Fair, September 14th and 15th. If you're in the San Luis Valley area, it's a free event. Go check it out and learn something.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.